afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nancy Cott. I am the director of the Schlesinger Library, and I am here to welcome you and also to introduce President Drew Faust, who will then introduce our speaker for her inaugural lecture. And this is an especially pleasant task for me because I remember very well the day that Drew Faust herself was inaugurated as the first dean of the Radcliffe Institute. It was a day early in March 2001 with an unexpected snowstorm. Now, we have an unexpected summer day, which seems to me just as good an augury, or perhaps even better. This was 11 and a half years ago, and then Dean Faust spoke about her research and thinking about death in the Civil War. Now, since then, that work of hers has become a book and then a documentary film, so I'm very happy to imagine that the same developments will follow from Liz Cohen's lecture today. But really, I mention this just to reflect briefly on how much has changed and grown at the Radcliffe Institute in that fairly brief space of 11 and a half years. The extent of accomplishment, the extent of growth in stature is really something to marvel at and appreciate. And many of you in this audience have supported and have also helped to shape that progress of the Radcliffe Institute. But no single person has done so more, both as dean and as president of the university, than Drew Gilpin Faust, and I would like you to welcome her.
Thank you. This is a great crowd. Liz, you packed the room. I'd like to welcome everyone once again, guests, friends, and I'd like to extend a very special welcome to the members of the Radcliffe Dean's Advisory Council and the Schlesinger Library Council. Now, it is a great pleasure for me to greet you, but my assignment here today is actually not so much to welcome all of you, but rather to join with you in an official welcome to Radcliffe's new dean on the occasion of her inaugural lecture. Now, it seems to me highly appropriate that the ritual of installation for a new dean here at Radcliffe has become a presentation of scholarly work. This is an institute for advanced study that is dedicated to supporting, advancing, and disseminating scholarship. Its leader is necessarily an intellectual leader, and that is what today's event is meant to feature and to celebrate. Now, when I had the pleasure of announcing Liz's appointment last March at a reception across the street at the ART, I spoke of her wide-ranging engagement in every aspect of Harvard life during her 15 years here on the faculty, her service as History Department Chair, as Warren Center Director, and so on. But today we focus on her scholarly achievements, which have won her national and international distinction. A Princeton undergraduate and a Berkeley PhD, she currently holds the Howard Mumford Jones Professorship in American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Her honors include the Bancroft Prize, the Taft Prize, the Guggenheim National Endowment for the Humanities, American Council of Learned Societies, and Radcliffe Institute fellowships. She was inducted last weekend into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has held Oxford's Harmsworth Professorship, and she has served as president of the Urban History Association. Now, all of this recognition has come because of the great originality and importance of her scholarship. Her first book, Making a New Deal, explored the lives of industrial workers in Chicago between the First and Second World Wars, demonstrating the ways popular culture shaped labor and politics, transforming ethnic identities and relationships of power within the city. Her investigation of vernacular consumerism, the role of radio, movies, shopping, and emerging mass culture, shifted the field's understanding of what mattered in both political and social history. Her second book, A Consumer's Republic, turned its attention to post-World War II suburbia and the evolution of the citizen purchaser as the defining force in American political life, as well as a critical component within a system of persisting and even expanding economic inequality. Merging her deep interest in the built environment with the tools of political and social history, Liz Cohen has crossed traditional disciplinary boundaries in ways that have brought fresh insight to some of the most pressing issues of our time. What an important contribution for a dean of the Radcliffe Institute to have made. Today, she will offer us a glimpse into her current research and thinking about the nature of urbanization, questions that have been at the core of her scholarly career. And she will present a lecture entitled Place, People, and Power, City Building in Post-War America. I'm delighted to give you Liz Cohen, Dean and Scholar.
Thank you very much, Drew, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I feel like I'm seeing my life flashing in front of me. You're here from many different walks of my life, and I appreciate that, and I'm also open to any movie deals. So, my goal today for my inaugural lecture as the third dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study is to use this rather young tradition, which was originated by Drew Faust and then continued by Barbara Gross, to introduce myself to you as an historian by sharing my current book project, Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. Before I begin, I would like to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to speak to you about my work and to lead the Radcliffe Institute. This dual commitment, I hope, will shape my tenure as Dean of the Institute so that I can fully participate in what this enterprise is all about, intellectually nurturing the fellows, faculty, and students, the library researchers, the audience members, and Radcliffe's own staff who participate every day in the Institute's programs. That, after all, is our mission: to stimulate and to support creativity and research, and then to provide a venue for sharing that work, whether through an intimate seminar organized by a Harvard faculty member or a former fellow, or in a large public lecture or conference. Working in such an engaging, multidisciplinary environment was a major attraction for me in accepting Drew's invitation to serve as the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute. And whatever success I may have combining the life of a scholar and a dean surely will benefit the Institute as well as my own work. The book I am writing sets out to understand the state of cities and visions for their future that prevailed after World War II, when Americans increasingly equated building a prosperous modern society with suburbanizing the metropolitan landscape. Whether the modern house, the modern school, the modern shopping district, the modern factory, or modern transport, all took a new suburban form. These styles, moreover, seemed increasingly to brand what was American in a world rebuilding itself after the destruction of the Second World War, even to the extent of providing in Nixon and Khrushchev's notorious kitchen debate a symbolic background for fighting the Cold War. This suburban imagery was a clear break with how modern society had been pictured in physical terms during the first half of the century, with a landmark building like the Chrysler or Empire State Building, or a site of cultural innovation like a movie palace, or a literally groundbreaking innovation in transportation like the subway, modern had meant urban. Even the most challenging problems of modern society, such as the slum and the sweatshop, were considered realities, if unwanted ones, of city life. Moreover, this post-war shift from urban to suburban ideal was not simply an aesthetic one. Demographically, almost all American cities outside of the newly emerging Sun Belt lost out to their suburbs after World War II, even as the nation's overall population grew 50% from 1950 to 1980. Over the course of the 1950s alone, in the 20 largest metropolitan areas, cities would expand by only 0.1%, their suburbs by an explosive 45%. It is particularly important to recognize the racial dimension of this demographic restructuring. Cities that lost in relative share of metropolitan residents also attracted new minority populations. While whites decamped for the suburbs, African-American migrants from the South and immigrants from Puerto Rico and soon elsewhere in the developing world arrived in search of more opportunity, often just as the good industrial jobs were leaving town. The modern, suburbanizing metropolitan landscape thus became a racially segmented one, further contributing to perceptions of urban decline and suburban rise. This ideological and demographic transition from urban to suburban was intertwined with two other significant historical trajectories spanning from the 1950s to the 1980s. The first was the political right turn from New Deal liberalism to anti-government neoliberalism. Although post-war suburbia was built through federal government subsidies in such forms as VA and FHA mortgages, the Federal Highway Act, and the mortgage income tax deduction, it ironically fed an appetite for political devolution from the national to the state and local levels. By the 1980s, the modest welfare state constructed during the New Deal of Social Security, unemployment insurance, collective bargaining, and fair labor standards, and enhanced during the Great Society of the 1960s with programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Head Start, faced enormous threat from rising tides of anti-statism, anti-unionism, deregulation, and privatization, much of it supported by suburbanites. The other accompanying shift was the less explicit, but no less significant transition from an early post-war ideal of building a strong, affluent America through broad-based mass prosperity to, by the mid-1980s, a growing acceptance of greater economic inequality. A small number of Americans gained increasing wealth and income, and the rest were supposed to benefit from trickle-down effects. In reality, however, the bottom four-fifths had to cope with a shrinking share of wealth and often a declining standard of living, only compensated for, in many cases, with the earnings of a second family wage earner, usually the wife. This retreat from a redistributive national state aimed at broadening the wealth, well-being, and purchasing power of all Americans left an imprint on the landscape, with an increasing segmentation of metropolitan areas into separate and unequal communities, with strikingly different access to economic resources and social services like good public schools. Aesthetic ideals, social geography, political ideology, and political economy all converged to shape a new kind of metropolitan America in the last quarter of the 20th century into the 21st century. Affluent suburbs and prospering post-industrial cities like San Francisco, Boston, Denver, and New York's Manhattan thrived, while poor, aging inner-city suburbs and deteriorating industrial cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, Baltimore, and I could go on, and the Bronx struggled to survive. These disparities were made all the more extreme by a new political landscape where highly mobilized voters increasingly resided in suburbs rather than cities and voted for policies they felt benefited them. And this political reality was on display just a week ago. You may have seen the headline in the New York Times, a Sunday Review. Of course, cities, even those hardest hit, did not disappear over the post-war period, nor did city leaders and residents committed to them simply roll over and resign themselves to obsolescence. Rather, urban proponents put up a fight, many advocating for and embracing a federally subsidized program that we have come broadly to call urban renewal, a strategy for city survival unique to this particular moment in time from the 1950s to the 1980s. Although the clear intention of urban renewal was to save cities, just the mention of it often raises the ire of many city lovers, who conjure up disturbing images of quaint downtown streets bulldozed for superblocks lined with large modern commercial and civic monuments. Fans of historic residential architecture still mourn the loss to the wrecking ball of blocks of charming, if dilapidated, row houses to make space for new and often antiseptic, subsidized housing units or high-rent apartments. Urban renewal came about because of the deteriorating state of many American cities after a decade and a half of deferred maintenance and minimum investment due to the deprivations of the Great Depression followed by the emergency conditions of war. When, after World War II, millions of Americans, many of them veterans, established new families and households, they encountered a huge housing crisis amid a crumbling urban infrastructure. Surrounded by idealized imagery of suburban living, reinforced by government mortgage, tax, and transportation policies that favored suburbia, Americans in large numbers took the bait, packing up and moving into garden apartments or new tract houses bought with little down. Retail stores and employers, many also struggling with outdated physical plants and enticed by tax incentives favoring new construction over renovation of existing urban properties, soon followed. Cities thus faced a double whammy: a loss of mostly middle-class, tax-paying residents and a decline in their economic base of retail, manufacturing, and white-collar employment. The federal urban renewal program that aimed to buttress American cities in the face of disinvestment and suburban exodus was built upon a series of federal laws, beginning with the Federal Housing Act of 1949 and then its successor, the Housing Act of 1954, which expanded the earlier law's scope from solely residential to include more commercial areas and permitted rehabilitation of existing structures, not just total clearance. Although there were shifts in emphasis over time, the basic concept in urban renewal involved the federal government making funds available to American cities to subsidize the demolition of the old, assumed to be obsolete, and the redevelopment of the new to jumpstart the private sector's investment in urban development. Once a city's master redevelopment plan was in place, federal monies in a 2-to-1 match with local contributions aimed to entice reluctant private developers to invest in urban projects by writing down, as it was called, the costs involved in clearance and redevelopment. Money was also available to address the shortage of decent housing available through various kinds of subsidies for the elderly, for those at low and moderate income levels, and for cooperatives run by nonprofit organizations. Urban Renewal, a program carefully negotiated around the interests and self-interests of lawmakers, housing reformers, planners, and the real estate and construction industries, sought to put federal dollars and authority to work revitalizing American cities as residential and economic centers. The goal was to transform them from fading 19th century industrial workshops, no longer appealing to many Americans, to more up-to-date places to live and work, whether jobs were in modernized manufacturing or a post-industrial fire economy, with fire standing for finance, insurance, and real estate, and one could add medical and other knowledge-based businesses. That the federal government seeded both suburban development and urban redevelopment in the post-war era should not surprise us, as it reflected the multiple constituencies seeking a federal leg up, as well as an emerging vision of the future metropolis as a fire-based economic urban core surrounded by suburban sites of living, consuming, and other employment. The criticisms of urban renewal were and still are plentiful, and in the case of Jane Jacobs' 1961 critique in Death and Life of the American City, hard-hitting and legendary. Jacobs championed the organic evolution of the city block that developed without government planners' intrusions, at its best featuring mixed uses, short blocks, varied building types, and population density. Her recipe for urban health has become the gold standard for many urbanists. Critics, some at the time, many more in hindsight, blasted urban renewal's opposite tendencies: the huge scale of its projects, the overly ambitious destruction of the existing urban fabric, the targeting of poor, often minority neighborhoods for redevelopment, a preference for modernist architecture, many deemed alienating, an overemphasis on highways, the lack of community consultation, and more. Those usually blamed for Jacobs's heralded death of the city were modernist planners, the administrators who implemented their vision at all levels of government, and local business leaders accused of self-interestedly allying with political officials to create pro-growth coalitions, willing to sacrifice ordinary people's quality of life for capitalist rewards. Now, many of these criticisms are deserved, but much is also lost in reducing urban renewal to a conspiratorial alliance between arrogant planners, soulless bureaucrats, and greedy capitalists. In fact, the neoliberal denunciation of government activism has only reinforced the tendency to see urban renewal as a parable of excessive governmental interference with some healthier, more natural form of urban evolution, and has led to enthusiastic slashing of millions of dollars from federal programs for cities and for subsidized housing, beginning in the 1970s. In short, what a wholesale dismissal of urban renewal misses is the ways in which it was an authentic utopian moment for urbanists who are bursting with a new vision of urban social life, economic vitality, and aesthetics. Although some of their strategies were undeniably flawed, their project deserves more thorough investigation that acknowledges variation over time and space, some learnings on the job, and more complexity in motives and actions. In other words, we need to analyze this important moment in city building as history. It is often overlooked that proponents of the urban renewal regime were New Deal liberals who, beginning in the late 1940s, viewed tackling the problem of the endangered city as the next great progressive cause, on a par with the unionization of labor, the expansion of the welfare state, and the struggle over civil rights. Many urbanists believed that saving the city was the new front line of the struggle that had existed from the earliest days of the New Deal, between, on the one hand, those like themselves who felt greater federal intervention could create a more equitable America, and on the other hand, their persistent rivals, the anti-government interests who put their trust in unobstructed capitalist market forces and private sector solutions, and fought like the Dickens for decades to block what they considered creeping socialism. Over time, the liberal urban renewers would inspire another opponent to their left, grassroots-oriented populists who would challenge their top-down, directive, social democratic methods. This critique would grow out of the New Left and Black Power politics of the 1960s, so that by the end of the urban renewal era, its promoters would be demonized as so-called big planners by the right and the left. I have set out in my book to look anew at urban renewal, keeping an eye peeled simultaneously on the human agency involved in city building, the variation in strategies and outcomes operating over time and space, and the importance of the physical built environment itself in this story. People, place, and power matter in understanding cities that underwent urban renewal over the period 1950 to 1980. In order to drill down even deeper, I follow the career of a prominent figure in urban renewal, Edward J. Logue, whose work brought him to many cities and spanned from the early 1950s until his death in 2000. Now, this is not a traditional biography, but rather an investigation where Logue serves as my main character and my vehicle to tracking a half-century of city rebuilding. Other secondary characters include the legions of staffers he recruited to his large redevelopment operations and launched into a new, thriving profession. His counterparts working in cities throughout the country and even the world, the public officials and local leaders he collaborated with over his career, the architects and planners he hired to design hundreds of projects, and the diverse public, partners, allies, and opponents, depending on the moment and on the circumstances. Ed Logue may not be a household name today, but he was well known in his day and remains so in urbanism circles and in the cities where he worked, including Boston. He was crowned, quote, one of the top 3 urban renewal men in the US by Time magazine in 1964, dubbed the Master Rebuilder by the Washington Post in 1967, described by Newsweek in 1972 as, quote, one of the most impressive movers and shakers of subsidized construction since the time of King Tut, end quote, and quite recently lauded by renowned architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable. As she despaired at the stalled reconstruction of the World Trade Center site, she called for, and I quote, not a Moses but a Logue, who would have provided the leadership that Ground Zero needed desperately and never had, a practical visionary who knew how to implement a plan without rolling over to every political constituency and special interest. After decades of turning dreams into reality, he knew a lot about what made cities good places to live and work, end quote. Logue began his career in urban redevelopment in 1954, when at age 33, New Haven's newly elected Democratic mayor, Richard Lee, appointed him to lead the city's major new effort. He came to that position as a Yale-trained lawyer with experience working for progressive causes such as labor organizing, civil rights, and academic freedom in the era of McCarthyism. Logue had just returned from India, where he had served as special assistant to Ambassador Chester Bowles and had observed closely the US State Department and Ford Foundation's community development programs aimed at modernizing India's villages. There, he watched reformers weave improvements in the built environment and infrastructure into their drive to promote a more democratic and anti-communist India. Building roads, wells, schools, homes, and clinics could not be separated, they believed, from efforts to reform land ownership or teach literacy or introduce modern farming methods. Logue returned home, ready to apply lessons learned in what was now being called the Third World to his work turning around a struggling first world city. And I quote him, "As you might have heard," he wrote to Ford's representative in New Delhi, "I am busy in a New England version of community development," end quote. Together, Lee and Logue attracted more federal redevelopment dollars per capita in New Haven than any other American city, as they aimed to make it a national laboratory for urban renewal. After 7 years in New Haven, Logue moved on to larger Boston in 1961, where Democratic Mayor John Collins recruited him to help turn around a near bankrupt and fast declining city as the head of a newly strengthened Boston Redevelopment Authority. There, Logue orchestrated, with an influx of federal dollars, what was called the New Boston, an ambitious plan for downtown and neighborhood redevelopment that aimed to be less destructive than the earlier West End project. And he did this until he resigned in the summer of 1967 to run unsuccessfully for mayor, losing to Kevin White. Soon thereafter, in 1968, Logue was named by liberal Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as president and CEO of a powerful, pioneering, statewide urban renewal agency, the New York Urban Development Corporation, known nationally as the UDC. Rockefeller armed the UDC with a mandate to build badly needed subsidized housing and other industrial, commercial, and civic infrastructure, the political power to employ eminent domain and override local zoning laws and building codes, and the financial wherewithal to skirt voter-dependent bond issues and instead to enjoy large state appropriations and the authority to self-finance by issuing its own bonds. From 1969 until 1975, Logue's UDC undertook extensive building, including 33,000 units of housing, and his personal pet project, the car-free, deliberately mixed income, new town in town, as it was called, of Roosevelt Island on what had been Welfare Island in New York City's East River. But along the way, the UDC got caught in a political struggle when influential Westchester residents organized to block the UDC's bold Fair Share affordable housing program in 9 wealthy suburban communities. The political backlash against the UDC that followed was made all the worse by the fiscal crisis overtaking New York City and New York State, as well as President Richard Nixon's impounding of congressionally approved federal housing subsidies upon which the UDC depended, as Nixon replaced Lyndon Johnson's Great Society with his own more conservative New Federalism. When the UDC defaulted on its bonds, Logue was forced, unhappily, to resign. A few years later, New York City Mayor Ed Cott appointed Logue to his last major job, which he occupied from 1978 to 1985, heading the South Bronx Development Organization, a relatively small operation compared to the UDC, mandated to help rebuild the badly ravaged South Bronx for homes and employment. Here, Logue was known best for the unusual and controversial project Charlotte Gardens, the construction of a new neighborhood of 100 prefabricated suburban-type homes substantially subsidized for purchase on burnt-out and abandoned land. The Reagan era of more limited, market-oriented urban policies not only forced Logue to shift strategy, but ironically, it also pushed him to collaborate more than he had in the past with grassroots community organizations, such as his partner, the scrappy nonprofit Mid-Bronx Desperados Community Development Corporation. The home ownership scheme also encouraged an architectural approach that more closely resembled private market offerings than the subsidized housing he had built previously. In this new funding climate, Logue concluded that modestly priced, thanks to prefabrication, which you see here, single-family, subsidized home ownership would have great appeal to lower middle-class New Yorkers eager to own their own homes. Although Logue acknowledged that, quote, "this stuff will not win the architectural awards that I have so enjoyed receiving," end quote, and in fact, the project was roundly condemned by many designers, in fact, most designers, he remained convinced that these houses and their financially and emotionally invested owners would provide anchors for revitalizing South Bronx. New Haven, Boston, New York State, and the South Bronx, these are the primary places of my urban renewal story, each contributing its own distinctive history and reflecting a particular moment of aesthetic vision, political possibilities and obstacles, and economic realities in the post-war saga of urban renewal. Other places matter too, as Logue traveled around the United States and looked abroad for models, such as the new towns of Britain and Scandinavia, when developing the UDC's New Town program. Finally, power matters also in my itinerary. Who wielded it, the balance of public and private sectors engaged in city rebuilding, and how power was etched on the physical canvas of a city. New Haven's renewed downtown showcased the big retailers who promised a commercial lifeline to a city leaking commerce and tax revenues to suburban shopping centers. Half a decade later, Boston would look to government offices at the federal, state, and municipal levels to reinvigorate its struggling downtown, building a government center complex on 60 choice downtown acres. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Roosevelt Island could only become what I have elsewhere called a great society utopia on the East River because of the robust federal and state housing subsidy programs available to the UDC. And a decade after that, Charlotte Gardens would take root as an early budding of what George W. Bush would later call the ownership society. These built environments are themselves visual cues to the political, economic, and social power structures that shape cities at particular moments in time. Taken together, the rubric of people, place, and power allows me to chart and analyze the shifting strategies of renewing cities over the post-war decades. Now, given the shortness of time today, I cannot lay out for you the full scope of this study as people, place, and power evolved over the course of Ed Logue's long career in urban renewal. What I will try to do is bring you into the first phase of urban renewal as Ed Logue and Dick Lee framed it in New Haven after Lee took office in January 1954 on a campaign promise to renew the city, fast deteriorating, it seemed, as factories shuttered, downtown department stores closed, a new interstate threatened to bypass downtown, and middle-class residents were moving in droves to suburbs flourishing outside New Haven's borders. While the population of the metropolitan New Haven area would increase 51% between 1950 and 1960, the city's population would drop 7.5%, leaving it only 50% of greater New Haven. And those with the highest incomes were leading the stampede to the suburbs. To help set the stage, I'd like to show you now a short excerpt from a WNBC TV documentary called A City Reborn, which aired in 1966. And I want to use it to draw attention to the documentary was doing it for what I want to use it for as well, to draw attention to Lee and Logue's ambitious plans for renewing the city. And they began it, as I said, in 1954, and a dozen years later, they were still at it in 1966.
75 miles from New York City on the Connecticut Turnpike lies the port city of New Haven. For most of its 330-year history, it has been best known as the seat of Yale University. But recently, as national attention has focused on urban problems, New Haven has become better known as a city that is solving these problems. In 10 years, more than $300 million have been poured into renewing New Haven. And the results are to be seen everywhere, in new housing, in new schools, in new stores, in new office buildings, and in the bustle downtown. The driving force behind the city's renewal effort has been Richard Lee, the mayor of New Haven for the last 12 years. Here he is talking about the city's latest downtown project and its largest.
Of money together to complete what is now underway here. What you see here at my right is a 19-story hotel, which is going to have 309 rooms and a banquet facility for 1,000 people. Below that is going to be 2 levels of parking below the surface for 300 cars. On the ground floor level, there are going to be 2 floors of shopping opportunities. And over at the corner of Church and Chapel, where that steel is a 14-story office tower, much of it already leased. The total investment in this part of New Haven, just in this so-called front block, which until recently was known as Lee's Folly, is something in the neighborhood of $15 million. It's astounding, it's exciting, it's exhilarating, and it's certainly a sign that the old downtown, as we have seen it and as we've known it for so long, has disappeared, and New Haven has become, or is becoming rapidly, one of the exciting new cities in old New England. I've always been confused by the lack of real planning in a city's growth. Most cities in America have never really been planned. They just developed. In very few countries in the world has there been any broad-based concept on a total plan. So when we began to replan and rebuild after we had this blitz of demolition, I felt that we were only going to build this city or rebuild it just once. And therefore, since we were only going to build it once, we should build it well and build it in as beautiful a fashion as we could. And the answer to that is that we should get the best architects. Now, what constitutes good architecture? I suppose it's like, what is a beautiful woman? It's a matter of opinion. But I know this, that in order to get good architecture, the architect first has to have a good client. And so we set out to get the best architects, and we did. And I like to feel that the city's been a pretty good client. While we haven't let the architect run away with his imagination, certainly some of the things that have been developed in the classic style of Paul Rudolph and the Roman ruin, which this garage is supposed to be, which are great buildings. And the firehouse, which we have a perfectly magnificent firehouse, if there's such a thing as a magnificent firehouse, designed by a local architect, Earl Carlin. And then, of course, just to name one other building, we have a school, a community school designed by Gordon Bunshaft and Dave Hughes of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And we have Philip Johnson, who has done a perfectly lovely building on the Oak Street connector for Yale. And finally, the last and the greatest of them all, in Mies van der Rohe, who's doing something in the neighborhood of close to 1,000 units of all kinds of housing. We really have brought together a sort of a panorama of great architects, and it will be a great contribution to the life of my generation, and I hope it lasts as a memorial for all time.
Well, anyone who has spent much time in New Haven since the 1960s knows that despite, and some might even argue because of, all the efforts made and money spent, urban renewal did not live up to Dick Lee's hopes and turn around this troubled city. In his masterful investigation of New Haven's long history of decline, city urbanism and its end, Yale political scientist Douglas Ray blames unfortunate economic timing for the city's failure, specifically the departure of good manufacturing jobs just as African Americans and other lower class populations arrived in search of them. Ed Logue would have agreed with Ray, while also criticizing Yale for not recognizing sooner its responsibility to the city. And that's not wrong. But I would also suggest that what Logue and Lee could not see as actors at the time were the deep contradictions in their well-intentioned quest to renew New Haven. Let me elaborate. Lee and Logue embraced several goals in their undertaking of urban renewal. The two they cared about the most, I would argue, were to create a modern and a racially integrated city. The latter ambition often unappreciated when urban renewal everywhere is written off as Negro removal. First, modernism. As you saw in the film, New Haven's urban renewers were modernizers. They were determined to bring what they viewed as a provincial, down-in-the-heels city into the fast-paced, prosperous post-war world that seemed to them to be exploding everywhere but in New Haven. That meant insisting on more modern ways of doing things, such as constructing new schools with the latest instructional facilities. It also meant rebuilding New Haven to look like a modern, ambitious city. Modernist architecture, sophisticated and universal rather than parochial and traditional in style, ideally suited their mission and provided a new vocabulary to express it. Lee and Logue embraced it with gusto. In their personal lives, they saw a taste for the modern as an important indicator of their political and cultural progressiveness, leading them both to purchase Danish modern furniture, and in the Logue's case, to build a unique Japanese-inspired modern house in New Haven. In planning the new city, they welcomed international-style design, recruited prominent modern architects, and incorporated major modernist principles into their plans. That commitment led to monumental superblocks and megastructures to create what they considered crucial urban grandeur and to accommodate an auto-friendly future. They also separated residential, commercial, and industrial functions within the city, removing commerce and light industry from residential neighborhoods and relocating a vibrant outdoor wholesale food market away from the city's downtown retail district. In redeveloped neighborhoods, they mimic suburban residential landscapes with low-density townhouses and apartment houses intended to be surrounded with park-like green spaces. Vincent Scully, a Yale architectural historian who was a native New Havener and later an apostle of postmodernism and a harsh critic of the city's urban renewal, recalled how in the 1950s, even he embraced modernism, and I quote him, "We wanted modern architecture. What did we mean by that? On the whole, we meant that we wanted forms nobody had ever seen before. Somehow we wanted to wipe the present clean of the past, to sweep it pure of contaminating objects. Everything had to begin anew and be closed anew. We would brook no compromise," end quote. Logue himself remembered the important lesson he learned when the first urban renewal building to go up was an architectural disappointment. And I quote him, "The memory of it has led me over the years since its completion to be appropriately demanding of good design when it hurts. That is the real test. Everybody is for good design until it hurts. It counts only when you insist on it all the way," end quote. But when these modernist principles were carried into the redevelopment of downtown and select New Haven neighborhoods, the results were problematic. The 93-acre, 3-square block commercial project in downtown New Haven that you heard Mayor Lee describe was designed as up-to-date modernist structures in order to compete with new suburban shopping centers and thereby reaffirm New Haven as the commercial hub of the region. To give the new stores and architect Paul Rudolph's massive attached parking garage easy highway access, the Oak Street immigrant neighborhood was razed to construct what was called the Connector, a multi-lane expressway linking Interstate 95 with downtown. Once there, the same desire for a modern look and feel led to windowless department store facades that insulated the stores from pedestrians and the street, preventing the mall's customer traffic from spilling over and benefiting the rest of downtown commerce. Likewise, when the renewers turned to improving the Dixwell neighborhood, which they considered a deteriorating black ghetto, they proudly constructed the moderate-income Florence Virtue Homes, designed by an up-and-coming young architect, John Johansson, as a model suburban-like community. Concrete block townhouses were surrounded by extensive open space with curvy roads, off-street parking, a school with a village-like bell tower, and a church, library, and community center. Commerce was kept away from the purity of these residential and community buildings and banished to a nearby but separate shopping strip with off-street parking. The de-densification that on paper seems so utopian in reality created vast urban emptiness that would disappoint their expectations. Ironically, as Logue and Lee worked to save the city from the suburbs, their application of modern design principles to New Haven's renewal suburbanized the city. As they undercut what differentiated the urban from the suburban, they hurt rather than helped the city's recovery. Lee and Logue's second goal, to create a more socially and particularly racially integrated New Haven, felt inseparable to them from building a more up-to-date city physically. Being modern to Lee and Logue meant overcoming the backward social patterns they felt were encased in the old built environment of New Haven, clearing away decrepit, often segregated slums and replacing them with better quality housing within more racially integrated neighborhoods were intertwined goals. A modern, slumless New Haven would by definition be a more racially just one, they were convinced. Rampant racial prejudice had concentrated racial minorities in old, poor neighborhoods like the Oak Street area raised for the connector. This neighborhood, traditionally a port of entry for New Haven's immigrants, was now 50% black, when the city was barely 15% so. Whereas immigrants had generally been able to move out as they acclimated to New Haven, blacks now got stuck there with few places to go. Logue blamed not just slumlords, but, quote, the unwillingness of most white Americans to share their neighborhoods with non-whites. Prejudice piles the non-whites on top of one another into substandard housing wrung slowly and expensively from retreating whites. All too soon, the overcrowding turns the neighborhood into a slum, end quote. Faced with this growing racial apartheid unfolding in front of their eyes, Lee and Logue responded with the same top-down, take-charge, re-engineering mentality that they brought to other aspects of urban renewal, and they made addressing it one of their top priorities in modernizing the city. They knew they could not leave this problem to New Haven residents to solve voluntarily. Fearful white New Haveners resisted efforts to build scattered site subsidized housing in middle-class white neighborhoods and to implement a controversial busing plan to desegregate New Haven's highly segregated schools. Likewise, the private real estate market only preserved segregation in allowing slumlords to artificially inflate rents and redlining banks to exclude minority neighborhoods from loans for home purchase and home renovation. Moreover, black leaders in New Haven welcomed Lee and Logue's efforts. In a 1950s urban world where inequities between blacks and whites were stark, racial integration seemed radical and appealing. Given the clear evidence that white New Haveners could not be enticed into black-dominated schools and neighborhoods, blacks sought access to white privileged spaces. And if the slums harbored inequality along with blight, then tearing them down solved both problems. The local NAACP bluntly argued, and I quote, urban renewal programs often present minority families with a long-awaited opportunity to move out of racial and economic ghettos into better neighborhoods with better housing, end quote. In a 1965 poll, New Haven's black population gave the strongest support to urban renewal of all ethnic groups, 83%, while in a 1966 survey of public opinion on urban problems, white New Haveners criticized urban renewal as a pro-black program that was leading to housing integration. Once again, however, an appealing plan on paper proved difficult to implement. What Logue considered his crackerjack relocation operation met obstacle after obstacle in relocating displaced black tenants. Beyond difficulties working with local landlords, federal legislation frustratingly limited the kinds of subsidized housing that could be built, favoring housing for the elderly and moderate-income nonprofit co-ops, for example, not rental housing for large families in attractive neighborhoods. Despite Lee and Logue's dislike of low-income public housing and their best efforts to make use of every other provision they could find, more often than they liked, public housing was just where dislocated black tenants ended up, not in the fantasized integrated neighborhoods on their drawing boards. Moreover, the renewers' preference for low-density design solutions, like the Florence Virtue Homes in Dixwell, limited options for relocating families. Although the project's prospectus hailed it as, and I quote, the first privately sponsored, FHA-insured, cooperative development in the country providing integrated housing, a daring experiment in reverse integration, end quote, when the 129 units were occupied by 55% blacks and 45% whites at opening, fewer black families found a place in the area than previously. It soon became clear that all these efforts at subsidized integrated housing were near impossible to carry out at a scale even approaching the numbers in need. The ideal of integration faded as the struggle focused on simply housing people. The first director of New Haven's Family Relocation Office resigned in the summer of 1956, despairing that, quote, "This job is impossible. There is more prejudice up north than there is in the south. When you answer an ad in the newspaper, all you hear is no children, no pets, and whites only." Logue personally promoted the link between renewing the city physically and advancing racial integration and a social agenda. In a 1957 letter to his old boss, Ambassador Chester Bowles, who shared Logue's deep concern over race in America, he wrote, quote, "Race relations and slums and blight are interwoven in such a way as to convince me that the only real hope of a solid, sustained improvement in race relations lies in an imaginative and vigorous urban renewal program," end quote. And when Logue determined that the city's physical renewal was not sufficient to solve low-income New Haveners' problems, he convinced Paul Ilvasacker of the Ford Foundation to give New Haven funding for a human renewal program, which became known as Community Progress Incorporated, or CPI. It pioneered the job training, pre-kindergarten, legal assistance, adult literacy, community health centers and schools, and other initiatives that would become the centerpiece of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in the mid-1960s. Mayor Lee and his team's ambitions were constantly acclaimed by streams of visiting researchers and dignitaries. U.S. Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz proclaimed New Haven, quote, "the greatest success story in the history of the world," end quote, in 1964. And the next year, the first Secretary of HUD, African-American Robert Weaver, pronounced it, quote, "closest to our dream of a slumless city," end quote. Thus, it came as a shock and a disappointment to Lee, Logue, and colleagues to discover that many of the New Haven residents they had set out to help were not at all happy, and in fact deeply resented their efforts. Opposition gathered steam slowly over the late 1950s and the early 1960s, culminating in an intense day in May 1967, when President Johnson's National Commission on Urban Problems came to town to hold public hearings on urban renewal. Former Illinois Senator and prominent liberal Paul Douglas and his blue ribbon panel intended to pay homage to the city's reputation for innovative urban renewal and poverty programs, and they expected to hear from a prearranged roster of expert witnesses, including Mayor Lee. To their surprise, they were met with members of the local community who demanded to be heard, and when heard, lashed out at their exclusion from planning for the physical and social improvement of New Haven. Their critique was articulated well by Fred Harris, president of the Grassroots Hill Parents Association, in his angry testimony to the panel, and I quote, "If you involve the people in the neighborhoods, they feel as though they are helping to decide what is going to happen in their community. We don't want to be going into white neighborhoods where we are not wanted. Let us stay in the slums, but fix it up so it will be decent, so we can live there. Sure, we should be integrated, but why force ourselves on people if it is going to create problems? And the poverty programs here, let's get some indigenous leadership in these programs. If they are involving the people like it's supposed to be in a so-called democratic society, then the people can answer their own problems," end quote. Harris and others who spoke had no complaint about the government spending money to improve their deteriorated, overpriced housing or training unemployed people for good jobs. In fact, they welcomed it. The problem was that they and their neighbors were being left out of the process of designing the programs intended to help them. In conflict here were two very different understandings of democratic process. On the one hand, Logue and the army of mostly young, idealistic, urban experts he hired and trained, first in New Haven and then elsewhere for many more years, considered themselves part of an exciting new national profession of urban administrators who, working in consultation with established community leaders, represented the public interest. They felt federal authority and funding provided them with independence that protected them from self-serving local private interests and corrupt municipal politicians. This form of democracy was lionized in Yale political scientist Robert Dahl's 1961 classic, Who Governs? Democracy and Power in an American City, which used the New Haven urban renewal case to argue for the triumph of pluralist democracy in America, where power was kept out of the hands of a small, privileged ruling elite. On the other hand, those like Fred Harris, who protested their exclusion from decision-making in urban renewal, brought a very different understanding of democracy that was shaped by the civil rights, anti-war, and other populist politics of the 1960s. They advocated for a grassroots, deliberative process that gave full voice to those most affected, arguing that they knew through experience the human costs of dislocation, even better than their own community leaders who were more frequently consulted. Both sides sought a more modern, more racially equal, and more economically viable New Haven with good jobs and good homes. But they envisioned two very different paths to getting there, both democratic in the ways that they understood it. Now, having laid out this history, and I hope conveyed that the failure of urban renewal cannot simplistically be attributed to big government's misguided involvement in city building, I would like to conclude by turning to the heart of the matter for me in this book. And that is, what has been and what should be the right balance between public and private sector activity in the ongoing rebuilding of cities. In a capitalist society like ours, public funding will never be primary or sufficient. Even with the huge expenditures of federal dollars for urban renewal during the 1950s and 1960s, city administrators like Logue and his elected partners still depended on private investment. What urban renewers tried to do, however, was to intervene in the marketplace and create incentives to steer that investment in urban rather than suburban directions toward what they considered worthy physical and social goals, not simply respond to developers' initiatives, which is so often the case today. They worked hard to distinguish between private sector participation, which they knew to be absolutely necessary, and putting private interests in the driver's seat, leaving public officials with little leverage to secure public goods such as affordable housing. As Logue put it with his characteristic bluntness, quote, "I've always felt you can't trust the private sector to protect the public interest," end quote. Where one could argue urban renewal failed miserably was in not taking its public mission far enough and figuring out how to engage citizens more in the urban planning process. Clearly, it is not easy to achieve true public participation without either sacrificing bold aesthetic and social visions or letting a project evolve into self-interested NIMBYism. This is a challenge that neither liberal urban renewers nor their neoliberal successors have figured out. And even Jane Jacobs, despite her call for more democratic participation, prescribed no real alternative to private sector-driven urban development that often failed to improve poor neighborhoods for poor residents or to protect them from the encroachments of gentrification. With this book, I am trying to move the story of urban renewal beyond the familiar, too comfortable, rather simplistic morality tale that has come to dominate urbanist discourse of a titanic moral struggle between the forces of good, usually associated with Jane Jacobs' critique, and evil, embodied often in the devil incarnate, the arrogant Robert Moses. I hope thereby to open up a new, broader, and more nuanced discussion of the ideal role of the public in charting the survival of cities, both through public funding of projects and public participation in planning. This is a conversation we once had when, as a society, we still spoke openly of public housing, public funding, public planning, and the public good. It is my hope that in revisiting the clearly imperfect history of urban renewal, I can reopen that conversation and bring in voices that have been silenced during 3 decades of enterprise zones, developers' incentives and set-asides, and a private market approach to subsidized housing that suffers from serious limitations. On the demand side, huge shortfalls in the available individualized HUD housing vouchers that we now depend on, and on the supply side, looking to corporate tax incentives to fund most new affordable housing through the low-income housing tax credit program, which rests on private, usually corporate investors seeking tax credits, not often the case in a recession when affordable housing is most needed. Very recently, the controversy over Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn has highlighted the difficulty of holding a private developer to promises to build affordable units in return for financial subsidies, zoning overrides, and access to government's eminent domain powers. Now, whereas many scholars have simply written off urban renewal as one more example of blind, diluted, or pernicious liberalism, I prefer to revisit it as an invitation to address hard issues that proponents like Loeb admirably struggled with if they did not solve, and which remain crucial struggles for American society today. These are tough questions, but there is no more appropriate place to undertake this conversation with all its historical significance, contemporary resonance, and interdisciplinary reach, from history and biography to architecture and planning to politics and policy, than the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I hope that tonight will only be the first of many opportunities. Thank you.
Homi Bhabha, Director of the Humanities Center in the English Department. Liz, that was an absolutely fascinating and incredibly relevant talk to our own times. The way you turned it around to talk about the aspiration of your own work and seeing how citizens could now really participate, given the history of what had happened and what you described, and how they could participate both as individuals and institutionally in a positive way in shaping the urban environment is important, really, not only, as you said, for the United States, but incredibly important for the development now in India, in China, and in other countries. The question I wanted to ask you, however, despite the large and lovely landscape of your talk, is a very parochial one. You said nothing about the way in which Yale University responded to this reshaping of New Haven. And when I think of the University of Chicago and the kind of almost, if I might put it metaphorically, pitched battles there, and the way in which the university intervened both, both in a kind of underhand way and an obvious way, and resisted and rankled at its reshaping and what happened in the area, I wanted to know about that, about the role played by Yale. And in contrast, say, to what was happening in Chicago, because the aims were not that different, as you pointed out. Thank you.
That's a great question, and the University of Chicago Yale comparison, I think, is a very good one, because we know how deeply engaged University of Chicago was in the Hyde Park area renewal, and there was even a discussion at certain moments of the University of Chicago moving if the neighborhood didn't improve. Now, that also was the case, as many of you know, for Yale as well, at a later point. Yale has had a very complicated relationship to its city. And people like, someone like Ed Logue was a product of Yale. He had been a Yale undergraduate. He was a law student there. He was very deeply connected. He never missed a Harvard-Yale game. And Dick Lee had actually worked for the university in their public relations office. He was very actively involved. He had a lot of ties to the city. But they ended up being extremely frustrated with Yale. And it was only when Griswold became president, pretty much at the same time in the 50s, that Yale started to join in with them recognizing slowly, and more slowly than Lee and Logue and others would have liked, that their own fate was tied to the city. I think the university had been very separate from the city and hadn't really recognized how tied it was. There was a real town-gown divide. The city was dominated by Irish and Italians, and increasingly an African-American population, and the university really held itself apart. They started to realize, though, that they really had a lot to lose if the city didn't make this work. And at a certain point when that downtown project, the Church Street project, was failing, they took a very important step, which is they advanced a huge loan to the developer, Roger Stevens, of the downtown project. And the Yale board of the Yale Corporation, started to wake up to the same problems. On the other hand, Yale was doing some of the same things on its own campus as Lee and Logue were doing in the city, which was to look to modern architecture as a symbol of bringing Yale into the modern post-war era. And they were building all kinds of cutting-edge architecture, attracting, Saarinen and many other important architects to their own building. And particularly, they were interested in making themselves a player in the sciences in the post-war period. Yale had traditionally been really a place where the humanities flourished and the sciences were weak. And they saw giving this kind of attention, you saw the Philip Johnson building, and there were many others, giving the sciences a kind of a modernist shape and form they felt would sort of make them a player in post-war science. So they were playing at the same game, sort of parallel playing, until it started to look like this redevelopment may not actually work. And, and many here, I'm sure, have Yale connections. This was a problem that didn't go away for Yale. And it was much later that they, started thinking about, we're going to do something really dramatic here, or maybe we should even move. I just want to say one other thing, which was the reason why Ed and Logue got to be so frustrated with Yale, is that so much of Yale property was off the tax rolls. And Connecticut was already punishing its cities. If you think about Connecticut cities, right? New Haven, Hartford, what else? Right, you all know. I mean, they're just one disaster after another. And part of that is the tax structure, which rewards suburbs and not cities. So yeah, the city was already struggling, and then to have so much of its property not taxed was huge. And they had a very hard time getting Yale to pay in lieu of taxes. Eventually, that did become Connecticut state law, and Yale did have to step up to the plate and contribute. But the whole property tax structure, which New Haven and Yale are not the only victims of, plays a very important role in this story too.
Hi, my name is Jamie Sabino, and even more parochial, one subway stop down in Central Square in Cambridge, this issue is being fought out. And it is the neighbors, the community, who are sharply divided. So you speak about bringing in community involvement, but you have two developing groups, one which says we're fine, no more density, don't build anything, and another says we need more commercial, we need more residential, please build. And I'm wondering if in any of the cities there were those kind of divisions within the people on the street, the neighbors.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point for you to make. We saw that in New Haven, and that there were there were many people who wouldn't have said what Fred Harris said at the National Commission hearings. There were divided neighborhoods. Take another. I didn't wanted to limit the number of cases that I gave you, but there was another very interesting neighborhood project in New Haven around Worcester Square, which many of you may know now has beautiful brownstone buildings. It's been quite gentrified. Yale has encouraged faculty to buy them and live there. That was the heart of the Italian neighborhood in New Haven. And when they saw what had happened, the leaders of that community saw what had happened in Oak Street and was happening in Dixwell, they went in to see the mayor, and they asked to be more involved in in the urban renewal of their own community. And that was coincidentally possible because of the passage of the 1954 Housing Act, which allowed more rehabilitation. And the point I was trying to make to you is that some of this was very driven by the way this federal legislation was written. But anyway, it was more possible. And so Worcester Square became really a national model of rehab rather than just demolition and rebuilding. But the urban renewers, Lee and Logue, saw Worcester Square as an opportunity to create a more integrated community. They didn't want to have it just remain the kind of white Italian neighborhood it was, and they wanted to intersperse subsidized housing within that. So there ensued a huge struggle, as you can imagine. Ultimately, there was some subsidized housing that was built around Worcester Square. And there, in this documentary, well, the documentary goes on actually to have a very big part about Worcester Square and shows how African Americans are moving into the community and shows people sitting next to each other on park benches, you know, but you can just imagine what the tensions were actually like as a result of that. So, you know, none of this was easy, and, you know, and yet we're back to that struggle that I was trying to convey between, you know, do you engineer what you think are the right values from the top? Do you sort of open up the doors and have real debate? On the other hand, there's going to be division. Can you find ways to bring people together? How do you avoid NIMBYism? How do you have, you know, we do also want cities to change. Freezing them in time is not, I don't think, what anybody would ultimately really want for American cities. So these are very complicated issues. And division among neighbors, renters versus homeowners. Just to make one more point about a division that Worcester Square brings out, the Italian homeowners were very happy with this rehab program that took shape. Renters were in a much more difficult position because they were going to then be having to compete to rent units in houses that, because many of them were subdivided into apartments where the rents were going to be much higher because the buildings were going to be rehabbed. That renting population was not so invested in the availability of cheaper loans so you can fix up your house and so forth. So clearly this is, you know, part of the mix.
Martha Hodes, history professor at NYU and a fellow at the Charles Warren Center here. Thank you, Liz, for that wonderful lecture. I grew up in New York in the 1970s, which, despite the current nostalgia for that era, was actually a pretty scary time to be there. And, of course, gentrification also has been very destructive in many ways, not only in New York, but also in European cities. I think of Berlin, especially east of Berlin after the wall came down. So my question is about gentrification, which the word only came up a little bit at the end of your talk, and I would love to hear you reflect a little bit about the relationship between urban renewal and gentrification, and especially if there was a time when that word had a positive rather than a negative valence. I know it's a big issue, but I'm curious about the historical trajectory from the 50s, 60s, 70s to what then became a buzzword, maybe late 80s and 90s, and of course into the present day.
Thanks, Martha. That's obviously another really important, very difficult issue. I think gentrification still, for some people, back to the divides, is a positive thing. Many people think it means that, you know, your property values go up and that neighborhood will be more viable, safer, and so forth. It's very complicated, and Logue was very much involved in sorting through those issues. And I could just give you one quick example, because we're getting close to 5:30. He and Jane Jacobs did not like each other, which shouldn't surprise you. They had a face-off at a panel, a program at MoMA, and Logue actually said, and I have to trust that he spoke the truth, at the panel that he had spent several hours that morning watching her street in the village to just see this dance of the sidewalk and, you know, what was so great about this. And his position was, and this kind of speaks to, I think, this complexity around gentrification, his position was, you know, that ultimately she was just going to let things evolve, and in a neighborhood like the West Village, that was going to evolve to a more and more upper-class neighborhood. And in another area where poor people lived, if there was no intervention, no subsidy, that is not what would happen. And he felt that what he said to her was, you can go about this and say, the organic development of the city, but what you're basically doing is allowing privileged suburbanites to not have to even think about the problems of the cities that they come into and work in during the day and then go home to their wealthy suburban homes at night. That was what led him to the Fair Share Westchester project, the bringing in affordable housing into those 9 Westchester towns, which ultimately undermined the whole UDC operation. But I think that, I don't have any simple answer, but I would say that people like Logue were fully aware, and because he did, and this is, if you walk away with one insight today, I hope it will be that these people who were so engaged with trying to figure out how to keep cities viable were not setting out to be racist. They actually had quite the opposite agenda, that they thought that they were trying to build integrated cities for everyone to live in. And Logue was fully aware that if we did not intervene in it was a fairly strong directive way, that you would have gentrification and whites-only neighborhoods. You would have black ghettos. You would live in a very segmented, segregated metropolitan area.
My question is past and future. In this moment, in different places in our world, is in growing. It's building new buildings in growing the cities, and we need at the same time take care with our environment. I would like to know what is your particular vision about it, because we need life in the future too. Thank you.
That's it's funny that but it's very important you raised that, and I was very aware and actually thought about putting in a piece about it after our symposium on last Friday on water. And some of you who are here now were there then, and we've spent a day thinking about the environment and the crisis of our current environment. And it made me realize how little these people were thinking about that. And first of all, the whole suburban strategy was one that was completely oblivious to that, right? I mean, it was sprawl, it was completely dependent on fossil fuels pouring into the atmosphere. And so, to some extent, the effort to save the cities and revive them, might have been argued for as environmentally more advantageous, but they weren't even the urban renewers weren't thinking that way. It's just an indication of how we got ourselves into the situation we're in now, and that for a very long time people were not thinking about these issues. So now I think we would all agree that we're dealing with a disaster, but you can see how we got here, where prosperity in the post-war period was so closely tied to blindness to environmental issues. Thank you all for coming.